You ready next?
Yeah, ready? Yeah.
Okay. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for the launch of my new book, The Political Thought of David Hume, The Origins of Liberalism and the Modern Political Imagination. We're going to have a conversation here, my two esteemed Hamilton Center colleagues and I. And we'll be talking for about 45 minutes. That'll be followed by 15 minutes or so of question and answer. And after that, you may get some more food if you haven't gotten food already. And there will be wine and champagne for those of you who are 21 years old and older with a valid ID. We also have copies of my book here, also if you're 21 years or older with a valid ID. And if you'd like, I can sign a copy. I promise not to get too much champagne on it. So I'm very happy that my wife and kids are here, as Corey Beth and Marcus and James Sanford. If you see them, please say hello to them. It's not often that they get to see Daddy in this role. I'll just yell a slight bit less during this presentation. So I'll present my esteemed colleagues here. The first person to comment after I provide about 10 minutes or so on the book's argument and how I arrived at it, Dr. Max Skjönsberg, Assistant Professor of Humanities at the Hamilton Center. He received his PhD in history from the London School of Economics. He's the author of the exceptional book, The Persistence of Party, Ideas of Harmonious Discord in 18th Century Britain. That was published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press, out in paperback. Yes, and fittingly, he was the David Hume Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at Edinburgh. In 2021, he was elected a Fellow to the Royal Historical Society, and I'm honored that he will be here to converse with me about my book. And we have Dr. Jeffrey Collins here as well. Dr. Collins is professor in the Hamilton Center, received his PhD in history from Harvard. He's the author of two excellent books, The Allegiance of Thomas Hobbes, published by Oxford University Press in 2005, and In the Shadow of Leviathan, John Locke and the Politics of Conscience, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. Dr. Collins is the author of many articles and essays and is a regular book reviewer at the Times Literary Supplement and the Wall Street Journal, and I'm anxious to see if I'll receive the Dr. Collins TLS treatment here. We'll see. That'll up the entertainment value of this whole thing. So without further ado, I'll take a seat here and begin discussing David Hume and the modern political imagination. Now, David Hume was a Scottish philosopher, historian, and essayist. He was born in 1711, died in 1776, and he was famous enough in his day that he was mentioned in a Jane Austen novel, Northanger Abbey, which was written around 1798, 1799. And in Northanger Abbey, a character, Miss Eleanor Tilney, is talking to her friend, Miss Catherine Morland, about her fondness of history. And she says in this excerpt from the book, she says that we can trust the speeches of these historical figures that are given in histories of England, even though they're embellished and somewhat fictitious because the historians are working, from their sources, yes, but also including elements of imaginative creativity. But she says history writing is good for uplifting and enlightening the readers. So this is what Miss Tilney says. I am fond of history, Miss Tilney writes, and am very well contented to take the false with the true. In the principal facts, they have sources of intelligence in former histories and records, which may be as much depended on, I conclude, as anything that does not actually pass under one's own observation. And as for the little embellishments you speak of, they are embellishments, and I like them as such. If a speech be well drawn up, I read it with pleasure, by whomsoever it may be made, and probably with much greater if the production of Mr. Hume or Mr. Robertson than if the genuine words of Caractacus, Agricola, or Alfred the Great. So Ms. Tilney here refers to two of the great triumvirate of British historians in the 18th century. That would be David Hume, William Robertson, and Edward Gibbon. And again, she says the speeches may be fictitious, but they are good for uplifting and enlightening their readers. Now, it's interesting that Ms. Tilney mentions Alfred the Great here, because one Hume critic used the example of Alfred the Great to show Hume's shortcomings as a historian. This is what Sir Francis Palgrave wrote in his 1844 essay, Hume and His Influence on History. In Hume's very elaborate life of Alfred, which occupies 1/4 of the history of England up to that period, he has concealed every passage, every fact, every incident, every transaction, displaying that active belief in Christianity which governed the whole tenor and course of Alfred's life. Hume, by repainting Alfred's portrait in coarse and gaudy colors, has thus daubed out all the characteristics of Alfred's individuality: his religious foundations, his devotional charity, his labors for the diffusion of the Scriptures, his constant seeking comfort and support from divine truth, his bodily penances and mortifications, and above all, that as king and legislator, Alfred entirely based his laws upon the Bible, declaring to his people that immutable truth which no other king or legislator has been sufficiently enlightened to proclaim, that if they obeyed the precepts of Almighty God, no other law would be required. So according to Palgrave, Alfred the Great, the 9th century Anglo-Saxon king, provides an example in which Hume deviated from his sources in order to conceal Alfred's characteristic Christian devotion. Now, why do I start off with these two quotes? One is to show that Hume was widely read, and he wanted to be widely read. He wrote his philosophical enquiries, his history of England, a 6-volume work that was a bestseller. He wrote his essays, moral, political, and literary, precisely so that they would be read by men and women in polite society, by the middling rank of society. And that goes back to Hume's first publication, his Treatise of Human Nature, a dense philosophical book published in 1739 and 1740. An early reviewer of this book said, this philosopher wants to be heard by everybody, and he wants to reform the opinions of everybody. And Hume did think of himself as a resident ambassador from the learned circles to conversable circles. We might say an ambassador from the ivory tower to the coffee shop, or TikTok, if you were alive today. The second reason I bring this up is that even Hume's essays and histories were influenced by Hume's ideas, his philosophy, his outlook, a systematic outlook that was first and foremost irreligious. And Hume was known as an irreligious thinker. In Great Britain, he was known as the Great Infidel. He was the story of his death, his deathbed behavior, was the equivalent of front page news. What would the rotund atheistic philosopher do on his deathbed, right? It would have been on the front of People magazine or in the National Enquirer. Housekeeper says Hume, acted thusly. People wanted to know, could an atheist, could an irreligious philosopher live well and die well? The 20th century Enlightenment scholar Peter Gay described Hume as the complete modern pagan. He said that Hume was the favorite corpulent uncle of the radical philosophic family in the 18th century. Now, in my book, I argue that there is a systematic vision underlying Hume's moral and political outlook. And I argue that that moral and political outlook is central to liberal thought, the development of liberal thought. Now, by liberal thought, I'm referring to the moral and political outlook that arose after the wars of religion, after the creation of the modern state, and the scientific revolution. And there are two strands of liberal thought, the utilitarian strand and the contractarian strand. And I think that Hume's philosophy, his moral and political outlook, that there's a worldview that both liberalism, both strands of liberalism, the utilitarian strand and the contractarian strand, that they share. So let me talk about these two strands briefly. First, the utilitarian strand, the 18th and 19th century British philosopher Jeremy Bentham was one of the prominent advocates and formulators of utilitarian thought. And he wrote that when he first encountered Hume's notion that utility is the foundation of justice, Bentham said it was as if the scales fell from his eyes. John Stuart Mill takes account of this when he's creating a lineage of utilitarian thought. He looks back at ancient and modern thinkers who regarded utility as foundational for morals and politics. And he looked back to Epicurus, the 4th century BC Greek philosopher. He looked at Horace, the Roman poet, and up to the modern period, Hume, Bentham, and Mill. So in these figures, John Stuart Mill saw a lineage of utilitarian thinkers, or in some sense, a nascent utilitarianism, but the spirit of utilitarianism was present among these thinkers. And similarly, Jeremy Bentham in the 19th century said that there were three schools that were trying to influence public law. One school was the religious school, Christians. The second school was the philosophic school, consisting mostly of neo-Stoics. And the third, he said, was the Epicurean school, that school which found in utility the source of moral and political legitimacy. And he saw, Bentham saw in the religious school and the Socratic school, the Socratic or Stoic school, a kind of stifling austerity, a portrayal of divine providence and nobility as a central part of human flourishing that he thought just could not serve as the basis of modern law. And he thought the Epicurean school had been castigated, denigrated by years of Christian and Socratic thinkers, and it was now time for the Epicurean school to form the basis of public law. And he said, Plato and Socrates, they were speaking nonsense when they were talking about virtue and vice. And just like Epicurus said, I spit on the noble, the tokolon, and any ideal of beauty deriving from the Socratic school. All right, now that's the utilitarian strand. The contractarian strand revived in the 20th century with the writing of John Rawls, the Harvard political philosopher. In 1958, in his first statement of his theory of justice as fairness, he says that the liberal vision of justice in society is a contractarian vision, and he traces a sort of lineage of contractarian thinkers too, and he includes Epicurus, Hume, Hobbes, and some others. And this might seem strange that you have Hume and Epicurus, ancient and modern thinkers, appearing on both lists. But the key idea that Rawls took from this tradition is that law, and the law of justice in particular, is a human creation derived from a utility calculation oriented toward mutual advantage. And utility, in the Epicurean tradition, can be translated as mutual advantage. And here, this links Hume and Epicurus, and here you have the common soil, I think, from which utilitarian and contractarian strands sprout. The attempt to not ground moral and political legitimacy in transcendent sources, but to do it in temporal sources, mundane sources, subjective calculations of utility and pleasure. And this is what I excavate in the thought of Hume and his predecessors and those who came after him. Now, contemporary scholars hesitate to label Hume as a contractarian or Epicurean, and part of that reason is that some of the 18th century critics of Hume, they did spot these elements that I find in Hume. But oftentimes, I think contemporary scholars, they look at Hume and they see, well, this seems like a modern, enlightened kind of dude. He advocated for a kind of scientific, empirical outlook, and he illustrates the necessary movement of philosophy away from enchantment and toward a more secular atheistic viewpoint. And so contemporary scholars tend to think, those 18th century critics of Hume, they're religious bigots, their words, not mine, or they espouse backward religious and philosophical views. They just weren't with the times. They misunderstood Hume, and they're inept. And I recall those 18th century critics, and I argue that they were, in fact, more adept interpreters of Hume than we often give credit for. And one thing related to this that I think is a key takeaway from my book is that, it's often seen as a historical necessity, the movement of our moral and political thinking away from classical and Christian sources toward skeptical and Epicurean resources. And I think that it's not a necessity. I think it's a choice made by pivotal philosophical theorists situated in their particular time. Now, after the religious wars, there was a need after the bloodbath, to use a word that has been revived recently, but I mean the bloodshed, the strife, the violence of the wars of religion. Pivotal philosophers said we've got to ground social life and cohesion in something other than Christian faith, and Epicurean and skeptical resources are useful for that. But it's interesting here that the findings precede the investigation. And what I mean by that is Epicurus, in the 4th century, he had two aims. One was to free his readers from fear of death, freedom from fear of death, and the second thing was freedom from fear of the afterlife. And so Epicurus, starting with those aims, investigated natural phenomena to show that natural laws are not affected by divine agents and to show that there was no afterlife. But the findings preceded the investigation. And similarly, I think that those arguing in the aftermath of the religious wars, saw resources and used those resources in order to develop a theory that would produce peace in a pluralistic society. And so my take, and I think one of the takeaways from the book, is that the effort to make politics less metaphysical required a lot of metaphysical thinking. And Hume, in his own words, tried to popularize a new, true metaphysics to replace the old, and I still think that's a central part of our modern political imagination. So thank you, and I look forward to the comments from Max.
Well, thank you, Aaron. First of all, I must say that this book, the book we're commenting on today, is a massive scholarly achievement. Really deserves to be celebrated, and it's an honor for me to do so. Here, together with Aaron, colleagues at the Hamilton Center, friends at the Hamilton Center, in particular, Aaron's beautiful and wonderful family. Beginning with the title of this book, so the political thought of David Hume, the origins of liberalism and the modern political imagination. A very ambitious title, and of course, very interesting and even mouth-watering one for anyone with an interest in Hume as well as in political theory. So the boldness of this book is really worth highlighting, because there have not been many book-length studies that seek to examine Hume's wide-ranging political thought in the round. So treating Hume's political thought is a daunting task because of the nature and the complexity of the source material. As Aaron alluded to, Hume was a quintessential 18th century man of letters. He wrote in many genres. So we need to piece together his political thought from various sources, including his philosophical works, his deceptively simple but really profound and difficult political essays, and his 6-volume History of England. So Aaron has mastered all of these sources, and he also draws extensively on Hume's highly readable but often cryptic correspondence. In addition, Aaron engages with what seems to me to be virtually all the major studies written on Hume in the last 100 years. It's evident that Aaron has read everything that's worth reading by and on Hume. And he's putting all of us who have occasionally dabbled in Hume scholarship to shame in the process. So this is a Herculean achievement by Aaron, especially, I would like to add, because I think it's, whilst Aaron is certainly fair and respectful towards Hume, I suppose it's fair to say that he's perhaps less sympathetic to Hume than many of us who study Hume tend to be. In the end, this book over-delivers on its ambitious title, because it's not only about Hume's political thought, but also about his philosophical, historical, and religious thought. Perhaps I should say anti-religious thought or irreligious thought. And Aaron, building on what he's already said, he shows convincingly in the book that we need to think of Hume's thought as a coherent system. This might sound obvious, but it is actually a very important move made by Aaron. So the most recent intellectual biography of Hume, so the one written by James Harris, published by CUP in 2015, took a different approach. So treating, Harris's biography treated Hume's different types of writings as separate episodes and belonging to different parts of Hume's intellectual life, as it were. Okay. So treating Hume's politics as part of his philosophy is a crucial part of this book. And as Aaron writes in the introduction, and I quote, "There's no kind of public political discourse that is strictly political." It's also worth mentioning that Aaron treats the reception of Hume's writings at some length, and he gave us a flavor of that in his introductory remarks, talking about Jane Austen. So the apt treatment of the critical reception of Hume's writings among his contemporaries in the Scottish Enlightenment in particular, so figures such as Lord Kames, Thomas Reid, today lesser known, but extremely important and towering figures in the 18th century. So this is one of the many highlights of this book. The one point I would like to push Aaron on is the one about Hume as a social contract theorist, and more broadly, the place of the social contract within what has become known as liberalism. Very important part of the book. Okay. So Aaron writes that, and I quote, "The social contract narrative tells us what justice is, how and why it came into existence. It informs us what society is and how it came to be." How it came to be and why. Okay. The social contract theory is about the origins of our duty to obey the government and the law, as well as the origins of states. So both of these things are viewed as originating in a form of promise or implied contract, and this is what gives it legitimacy. So the basis of the contract in the usual form is that we obey government as long as it protects our rights, and at least according to John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, we have the right to resist any government that acts tyrannically and invades our rights. So Aaron's argument why Hume should be considered as a social contract theorist, despite his efforts to demolish Locke's contract theory and Locke's theory of resistance, is subtle and clever, and as he's already alluded to, it's drawing on and it's in agreement with John Rawls. So the first question I have for Aaron is why he thinks that Hume was so keen to present this political thought as an attack on contractarianism if it turns out that he was a closeted contractarian. My own suspicion is that John Rawls, when we think about early modern philosophy, he can sometimes lead us astray. And to some extent, perhaps Aaron agrees with this, because he notes in the book, and rightly in my view, that Rawls read early modern philosophy through the prism of his own philosophy. So let's think a little bit about the social contract, tradition, and political liberalism. So of course it's true that Locke, Jefferson, Immanuel Kant, and more recently Rawls, unlike Hume, deliberately position themselves within the social contract tradition. And today we tend to think of them as liberals, and of course this is Rawls' self-description. And because Rawls has become such a dominant force within Anglo-American liberal academia, we tend to forget that important and disparate figures in the broad-based liberal tradition, such as Montesquieu, Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Alexander de Tocqueville, and Friedrich Hayek, were not social contract theorists, and they were usually critics of the social contract. Of course, Aaron talks at length about the utilitarian tradition as an alternative tradition of liberalism. My suspicion is that the tradition, the anti-contractarian liberal tradition, is broader than simply 19th century utilitarianism. So there is a tradition of political liberalism which Jacob T. Levy has called liberalism against the social contract. And I think that Hume has a very important place in this tradition. And in order to understand why, at least I think this is important, and I look forward to hearing Aaron telling me why I'm wrong, but I think we need to turn to the English philosopher Michael Oakeshott. So Oakeshott held that there were three broad analogies for thinking about the modern state. So first of all, the state as a natural community based on blood and similar to the family. Secondly, the state as an artificial community created for a specific purpose. And thirdly, the state as a historical community. So the most common way of thinking about the state as a natural community in the modern world is the ideology of nationalism. As Oakeshott points out, there has probably never been a modern state that has been based on whatever we take the word nation to mean, whether we refer to a linguistic community or an ethnicity or some kind of combination. We can leave that form of community to the side for the present purposes. But we need to think about the state as an artificial community. So if the state is artificial, we have to ask the question, who is the artist? Who has created the state? So within the social contract tradition, the answer is that the members have created the state. And they have created the state through an agreement with one another and sometimes also with the government. So in this way of looking at the state is recognized as a collection of human beings united by an agreement in pursuit of a common purpose. So different purposes have been identified through time. So the glorification of God in Calvin's Geneva, peace according to Thomas Hobbes, and the protection of rights and property according to Locke and Jefferson. So social contract theory belongs to the second way of thinking about the state as an artificial community. So let's now come to the state as a historical community. So a historical community is not a natural community, but it's a community that has been brought together by contingent events of different kinds, and very often they have been wars. And this is a point Hume makes explicitly. But understanding the state of a historical community also suggests that it is not artificial because there's not an artist. So a historical community is a product of human choices, but human choices made by many generations over a very long period of time, often centuries. And solidarity emerges from a continuous and common experience. So what unites people on this understanding of the state is less substantial than a natural bond, but also less fragile than a common purpose. And this way of thinking about the state really came to the fore in the Scottish Enlightenment. Figures such as Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson contributed to thinking about the state in this way, and they really drew on David Hume, and they were inspired by Hume. I also happen to think that Edmund Burke belongs to this way of thinking about the state, though I think he is closer to the social contract tradition than Hume. So he says explicitly that the state is based on a contract, which of course he goes on to define in his own way. So other thinkers who have thought about the state as a historical community include Vico, Samuel Coleridge, Herder, Hegel, and of course Michael Oakeshott. So I think reflecting on these figures, these philosophers, I think the first thing we have to recognize is that terms such as liberal and conservative explain rather little when we are thinking about the thought of great philosophers, such as the ones we are talking about here. If we want to use these terms, I think we should also recognize, and together with Jacob T. Levy, that thinking about the state without a social contract is the more liberal way of understanding the state. Because social contract theory makes genuinely pluralistic politics difficult. So a social contract implies agreement and a common purpose, but this is not what liberal politics is actually like. And to give a few examples, so many universities in Europe and in the US are going to be older than the political societies they are situated in, and of course this is even more true of churches. So it's really when the legitimacy of these secondary associations, so what Montesquieu called intermediary powers, it's really when we recognize the legitimacy of these associations and institutions as being more robust than a social contract that we know that the state is a liberal one. So I would argue that the most important contribution of liberalism to politics is not social contract theory, nor is it utilitarianism, but rather what liberalism was associated with when it became an ism in the 19th century, so constitutionalism. And Aaron notes in the book that Hume wanted to inspire a revolution in opinion of constitutionalism. The most important constitutional revolution he played a role in inspiring was the American constitutional revolution. So this is really where I see Hume's contribution to modern politics as vital, perhaps especially in terms of his influence on the authors of the Federalist Papers, and in particular James Madison's 10th Federalist. So to conclude with a question for Aaron, I would like to hear more about what he thinks about Hume's influence on America, not so much the American independence, but more the US Constitution and the most eloquent description of its intention in the Federalist. So thank you, Aaron.
Thank you. Shall we go to Jeff, and then I'll respond to both?
Yeah.
All right.
So I'm going to edit my comments a little bit because Max anticipated some of them. But and let me begin by saying that the book is superb. It's lucid, it's wide-ranging, it's judicious, it's thought-provoking, so read it. And Max is quite right. Pulling together a kind of coherent political theory out of the different genres that Hume wrote in is a notoriously difficult task. And Aaron pulls it off beautifully. And it's an engaged, and he knows how to make an argument. The book argues. It's not just a sort of, your wife is laughing. So it's a wonderful book. And its major argument is, of course, to place Hume at a real junction point in the history of liberalism, and to use Epicureanism as a way of kind of conceiving of the kind of metaphysical stakes of liberalism. I do have some questions about the coherence of Epicureanism as a tradition in the way that it's presented here. This is an observer's category. It's not Hume's category, really. Hume does not, as far as I know, call himself an Epicurean. And I did have some questions about that. I mean, I wonder, for instance, about Locke's role in this. I mean, Locke doesn't function the book as much as Hobbes does. Hobbes is a kind of clear predecessor for Hume in Aaron's account, and it's very interesting to see that and see it carried off so well. I gather from some things you say that you read Locke as a kind of Hobbesian, as a sort of, this is almost reminds me of a Straussian reading of Locke, but I wonder about that. I mean, Locke was not a metaphysical materialist, though he opened himself up to the possibility that that was the case. He was not a metaphysical materialist. He was much more traditional on natural law questions, if not entirely consistent on the matter. He, as far as I know, his views on free will are rather more like Epicurus than Hume's might have meant, well, or than Hobbes's were, certainly. So there's a sort of shakiness there, and I do wonder about Locke as a kind of contractarian thinker who sits somewhat outside the Epicurean tradition, which raises the question as to whether there are more plural sources for this kind of contract theory of politics. One can think of the scholasticism of the 16th century, or even biblical covenants, and covenantal line theology and so forth. This isn't a question about Hume so much as a question about how you're construing contractarian thinking or social contract thinking and liberalism as itself Epicurean, materialistic, purely conventional, artificial. So I'm kind of pushing you on this definition of liberalism that you're giving us. Locke, it seems to me, may suggest that there are kind of alternate ways of conceiving of the social contract which do not carry the metaphysical implications that you freight it with because you associate it so strongly with Epicureanism. I agree with some of Max's reservations about this notion of Hume as someone who sort of renders politics purely a function of artificial convention agreed to as a kind of political act. To me, I mean, you have this ambiguous, I think to some extent I'm getting my reservations from your own account, which speaks to its subtlety, because you speak of Hume offering a naturalistic form of contract theory. There's some play in the joints there. Naturalistic in what sense? Because you've told us politics isn't natural for Hume in the way. When you say not natural, you mean not with Filmer that we could read it off of the family or hierarchies of nature, but rather that it's a function of natural, universal natural reason or natural law, I take it. Of course, Hume rejects that. But as Max suggests, this is not sort of a sort of lawgiver, artificial, you know, we sit down and kind of drop and stuff. This is evolutionary, it's sociological, it's historical. It has a kind of universality that's rooted in, and again we hear Hobbes here, our nature as beings, right? Our thrownness in the world. So I think, you know, I would maybe ask you to kind of give us a little bit more on this artificial versus natural distinction and whether it quite captures what Hume is about. And the last thing I wanted, I am going to shorten these comments here because I want to leave some time for questions. The last thing I will say here is that the big argument and conclusion of the book, which is going to be controversial, but which is boldly argued and it's profoundly important to consider, I think, is that Hume, as a sort of atheist, Epicurean conventionalist, represents sort of the dark heart, if you will, of Rawlsian liberalism, right? And you have no truck with this. You're not sympathetic to this. You think this is a sort of thick metaphysical position that's kind of posturing as a neutral form of political theory. And, you know, I take it you're borrowing from your notes, but also just from my knowledge of this, that you're borrowing from Taylor and Sandel and others. making this case that this form of liberalism is philosophically, anthropologically, and metaphysically makes a lot of claims. And things like the autonomy of the individual, the arbitrary nature of our values, the priority of happiness and prosperity, the impossibility of universal moral reasoning, these are not neutral claims. They're strong claims, and they're fundamental, as you see it, to the liberal tradition, and particularly to the contractarian tradition. And I take your point. You expose nicely how relentlessly this kind of faux neutrality is used to sort of project kind of highly restricted forms of public reason and so forth, to marginalize classical and Christian moral reasoning. And conservatism, Aaron suggests, is kind of a modern conservatism, just kind of a quisling form of this liberalism. So there's no point in really worrying ourselves about whether Hume's a conservative or liberal. This is all part of the same project. So I'm sympathetic to a lot of this, as you probably know, but I do wonder about the implication that a liberal political dispensation or disposition necessarily requires a full-throated acceptance by the public or by individuals of this very thick liberal political project that you describe. Can a committed Christian or Republican or Stoic or Muslim or what have you live as a modus vivendi liberal, perhaps recognizing liberalism as the best regime available in a paganized world, or do liberal regimes, as you suggest, inevitably drift into a kind of perfectionist mode? And now more can be said about this, but it does seem to me that there's another critique of liberalism. One could find it maybe somewhat fancifully in Machiavelli to some extent, but certainly in Nietzsche, which says that liberalism is in fact built upon the presuppositions of Christianity, that it is the realization in political terms of Christianity. Its focus on equality, its notion of rights, its notion of the individual, the importance of conscience, the importance in some sense of consent. That those things are Christian and that are essential for liberalism, that it's really kind of impossible to imagine an actual liberal, Stoic, or Epicurean regime. I mean, in ancient terms, it's sort of impossible to imagine. And in an odd way, it seems to me, I mean, Hume, in your beautiful account of his histories, sort of dismisses the notion that Christianity in the Middle Ages had the capacity to soften, humanize, render people more civil. And I think most historians would view this as one of Hume's stupidest historical arguments. It's been rebuked again and again by historians of the Middle Ages and of ancient Christianity. In an odd way, you're sort of taking it on board so you can kind of invert the valuation to create this kind of gap between liberalism and Christianity. But I wonder if we have a more kind of sensitive understanding of Christian history, of its capacity to domesticate, soften, render us more civil one to another, render us more equal as individuals, bearers of conscience and as agents of consent. Do we reveal the compatibility of a certain form of liberalism, not Hume's perhaps, and Christianity? And so that what Hume is representing is a much more sectarian, and that you're, in that sense, there is some limitation to your attempt to use Hume to completely detonate liberalism as a legitimate political order. But anyway, enjoyed the book a great deal. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you very much. Both of you, those are rich questions, and I would like to approach them as much as possible in the few minutes we have remaining. I mean, these are some heavyweight challenges and observations, and that's what I expected, so thank you. All right, I'll begin with Max, who mentions that the title of the book is mouth-watering. Thank you. That was my instruction to the editors. I said, with a title here, I want it to be mouth-watering. I want the people to respond to it in the same way they would respond to chocolate cake. And so they did it.
I did.
They did it. Yeah, thank you. It's a unique person. I guess nerds, so thank you. All right, so did Hume present himself as a critic of the social contract tradition? You mentioned that he does. I don't know if he presents himself as a critic of the whole social contract tradition because he refutes particular elements of Hobbes and Locke, for instance. So I think He criticizes Hobbes' view of the state of nature. He says it's sort of fictitious, didn't really exist. But yet, as Hume's own critics observed, he does use some sort of state of nature concept subtly. Hume was also keen to separate himself from Hobbes because of Hobbes' reputation. Hobbes was reputed to be a skeptic, atheistic, and there was a great hostility to his Leviathan, over 100 treatises written, in the 17th century. And Hume wanted to avoid that fate, but he couldn't avoid that fate. Even the early reviewer of the first reviewer of the third book of the treatise said, well, this reads a lot like Hobbes. And later on, Hume tried to separate himself, but half of the reading public thought, oh, this is another Montesquieu. Half of them thought this is another Hobbes. So he never completely succeeded there. And when he's critiquing Locke, I think this is part of his, you know a lot about this. Matter of fact, I draw on a lot of your work in my book, but his critique of the parties. I mean, I think it's a Whig, the speculative theory underlying Whiggism that he is critical of. Locke's conception of the historical original contract as the source of political obligation. So we are obligated to obey government because we made some sort of promise. Hume says there's no historical validity to this. Similarly, Hume doesn't abide by the ancient constitutional vision of the country Whigs, who would say, like, well, there was an ancient constitution, it has become corrupt, and we need to return to first principles. Hume doesn't abide by that either, and so Hume does have this, his own theory. I mean, I think he's following on Hobbes and Locke in a lot of ways, and not criticizing social contract tradition as a whole, but specific elements in Hobbes and specific elements in Locke, particularly those related to the party disputes of the day. And there's a lot more could be said about that, but I'll leave it there. Second, you mentioned liberalism against the social contract, and you say Hume might be a central figure here in this historical analysis of the development of the state. And Hume is complex, and John B. Stewart, a 20th century Hume scholar, said, in some sense, Hume hates history because he looks back and sees the majority of history as useless, but it becomes useful in the modern age with the Tudors, with the development of the of commerce, centralization of the state, and that's when history becomes usable. So even here, the underlying economic vision, like the skeletal structure that he provides in the treatise, his account of the history of England seems to accord very nicely with that. And so, like, some of the missing elements in Alfred the Great's life, John B. Stewart's comments, Hume somewhat hates history because he doesn't just take all of it. He has a theory of progress that fixes his understanding and his analysis of historical development. It's not love that's the central element here, it's economics. That's another thing that John B. Stewart says. But you are right to point out Montesquieu, Tocqueville, Lord Acton, who you didn't mention, but he could be included here. Liberals who seem to not be atheistic, materialistic, and who have really interesting, robust analyses. And I think one interesting observation is Montesquieu and Tocqueville, I'm not sure how much they're read in politics classes. They're definitely taught in the Hamilton Center, and I love teaching them, and they're worth teaching. But Hume is read in philosophy classes and philosophy of religion classes. And so there's something about his metaphysical or philosophical insights that I think stretch beyond sociology and political philosophy. That's worth mentioning. And you note constitutionalism. And I think if we were to use constitutionalism instead of liberalism, there would be a lot less of this metaphysical or philosophical freight, because constitutionalism itself, could refer to, the Constitution of the Catholic Church, or Pope Gregory the Great's, or Gregory VII's reforms, or the conciliar and movement within the church. And you could have different mythical narratives underlying that constitutionalism. And and I'm going to mention this in a response to Jeff, but I see a kind of Republican mythical idiom, a Christian mythical idiom, and a liberal one. And there are resources here that depict the human person in particular ways. And just thinking about constitutionalism as political machinery that can fit into different societies and different intellectual cultures and actual cultures, I think would be fitting. And that's the kind of thing I see Tocqueville and Montesquieu doing. Tocqueville and Montesquieu also, analyze the religious foundations of constitutionalism. They mention the aristocratic and hierarchical elements, the value of nobility and honor. So all these things that I see Hume and Hobbes and Bentham sort of getting rid of, and these sort of take, they depend on a kind of feudal sort of view of Christendom, like that's where honor might be located or rooted, or also in the ancient Republican, Roman Republican, imaginative space. And so that leads into the third question that you had about American constitutionalism. And David Hume played a great role in the development of the American Constitution. Douglas Adair, a 20th century scholar, said that Hume's essays were Madison's favorite book. He definitely read them a lot. And you have the picture of, the mental picture of Madison having Hume's essays next to him as he's penning, as he's writing Federalist 10. And there are essential elements of American constitutionalism that are drawn from Hume, including the idea of the extended republic and factionalism. Hume's idea that a republic, which is typically riven with faction and tribalism, and so not long-lasting, it can endure for longer periods if it's in an extended space with factions pit against each other without one dominating the rest. And another element, I think, is Hume's political methodology, looking at experience and history in an attempt to look at where constitutions went right and where constitutions went wrong. So in the Federalist Papers, when Madison's looking at ancient Sparta and Carthage and the state of Maryland, he's looking at successes and failures historically, and I think Madison takes on this kind of approach in the Federalist Papers. Now, I think Hume and Madison also depart in important ways. One way is that, Madison, like his teacher John Witherspoon, who was a great critic of Hume, Madison notes that justice, truth, and reason ought always to be the authority in public deliberation. And another argument that he has that Hume doesn't have for the extended republic is that in a greater space you'll have more virtuous, wise, and reasonable people to choose as representatives. So there's this orientation toward some sort of authoritative, truth or reason that ought to be strived for, and the political institutions and the framework are reserved for limiting abuse of power. And Madison does know, like, these are auxiliary precautions, but the first goal is to generate wise government, and I don't see that positive element in Hume so much. The other thing is Hume is more of a centralizer. I think this is evident in his idea of a perfect commonwealth, his essay. Hume is an urban thinker, cosmopolitan, commercial, and Madison thought that the American Republic was going to be primarily agrarian for quite a while. And so in thinking this, I think Madison rather draws upon a kind of Roman Republican set of virtues of self-government, frugality, independence, that Hume does not value highly due to that, what I call the liberal idiom in which he's writing. And so this is a helpful transition, I think, to Jeff's questions, which are really good. I don't really deal with Locke. I mean, he is a mysterious figure. I'm somewhat sympathetic to the Straussian reading of Locke, but I don't think that's entirely right either. There's a great book on the American Constitution by Morton White, in which he says the philosophy underlying the Federalist Papers, there are two of them. There's the empirical political philosophy, and then there's the demonstrative moral philosophy. And so one of the things that I was thinking about when writing this book is what ideas fit together? Where does the puzzle come together? If you are a contractarian, what is contractarianism's native worldview or metaphysical space? Like where do the puzzle pieces fit? And I think that Strauss can interpret Locke as some sort of like secret Epicurean or Hobbesian because he never fit those puzzle pieces together. And I do think that's a problem. So in my interpretation of, this kind of Humean, Epicurean, Hobbesian tradition of liberalism, I mean, I see like that's just where you're going to end up if the language that you use is one of justice as utility and pleasure, because the other frameworks will be squeezed out. So the mythical resources that I mentioned, I mean, in the Roman Republican tradition, you have law as a teacher, you have the lawmaker who brought the community together and through speech helped the community elevate reason over passion so that they can govern themselves and the community can govern itself. And self-government here is a moral word, it has moral weight. And the Christian view of creation, fall, and redemption widens the view so the state is not the end-all be-all. And you have another source of limiting the state, and then you have a transcendent source wherefrom you can derive thoughts on mercy in addition to justice. So it's a much richer civilizational body that I see as a true kind of conservatism, and maybe the constitutionalism maybe is a better word, a kind of Western constitutionalism that draws on Greek philosophy, on Roman law, and on the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. And here's the TLS treatment. I do say that Hume's contract is naturalistic and artificial. I was hoping that nobody would see this. I guess he read the whole thing, so thank you. So what I think is Hume, philosophically, he gets rid of the intellect. So the intellect was a faculty in Aristotelian and Platonic and much of Greek thought, and in the scholastic Aristotelian tradition. But Hume says there's no faculty of the intellect, it's only the imagination, where we get sense experience, but we don't abstract, like there's no innate faculty whereby we abstract from the imagination and learn the true forms of things. And I think this is one of the ways in which, so what Hume regards as natural is human beings coming together, and the most they can do is really generate peace by means of commerce and trade, and that's the peak of what they can do. And so I think, that's what I mean there, and I agree that the language can be confusing. And then your third question, which is important, I remember I had a student at Furman helping me with citations, and he came into my office after reading the book, and he said, "Dr. Zubia, are you saying that liberalism is anti-Christian?" And at first I was like, no, gosh, that guy, whoever would write that book sounds like a nut job. What an extremist, my goodness. And then I went home and I said, yeah, that's what the book is saying. But, there are other resources, but I do think I think the liberal mentality is what I outlined in this book. I see it as the trajectory, and so that's why I think it's worthwhile looking at those resources that Hume discarded. And just as Hume was responding to enthusiasm. He was around impolite dinner partners. Like, it's not fun to have conversations with people who are going to be like, hey everybody, have some champagne, but don't dance here, okay? No dancing. By the way, seriously, no dancing after this. But, Hume is responding to overbearing, puritanical people. And look, Hume was a pleasant guy. It would probably be more fun to have dinner with him than to have dinner with someone else. And so he was responding to religious wars and enthusiasm that were disrupting public life. Now I think our problems are different, and it's probably time for a reversal and a recovery of some of those elements that Hume discarded. So those are my response, and I think perhaps do we have a couple of questions from the audience, and then we can get some more food in your bellies. Alan?
Thank you. You've got me salivating. So, hopefully it won't spoil my appetite to ask you, did you come across any notable influence of Machiavelli, either on what you're calling
Yeah, great question. There is, I mean, Hume read Machiavelli, and there's some, and Machiavelli was alive when Lucretius's On the Nature of Things was translated into Italian, and recovered, and Lucretius authored a didactic Epicurean poem on the nature of things. And so in the dialogues on the discourses on Livy, there's a sort of evolutionary presentation of the formation of the state that sort of sounds like what Lucretius might have given. Some people have argued for a Machiavellian realism that Hume sort of takes on board. And Machiavelli is one of these figures who is looking backward at a kind of Roman Republican model that he thinks has been lost. But he's also one of the first moderns in important ways. And so there's Machiavelli, some influence from the Epicurean strand. Hume definitely has read Machiavelli, but I don't find it quite as useful to link Hume with Machiavelli. I mean, there are similarities there, but Hume is much more interested in commerce, faults Machiavelli for not taking account of commercial developments. And then Hume writes a lot on the economy, his political discourses in 1752, largely on economic topics. And so, I mean, I found it less useful to, compare those two thinkers. I mean, I think they're better engaged with, on their own. Thanks, Alan. Carlos.
You talked about the origin of Bentham and the influence of Hume. Well, my impression up to now is that he was much more dependent on Helvetius, which in truth was one of Locke's essays concerning human understanding. I think that the essays concerning human understanding had a strong influence on Hume, enormous. I think part of the reason why Hume criticizes Locke is because he depends on Locke so much. He needs to differentiate himself from the idea. That's my impression, that the utilitarian tradition comes through Helvetius from the essays.
That's a great point. I mean, Hume read the essay on human understanding closely, and he's in conversation with Locke and his theory of perception, and he distinguishes himself from a kind of Lockean a theory of ideas, but then of course he takes some of it on board, but he distinguishes himself, and he certainly distinguishes himself from Locke in the political theories. And I mean, one of Hume's main arguments is that feeling, natural beliefs, habit, and custom, this is where we can justify some of those beliefs that we take on faith, in the existence of external objects, continued existence of external objects, personal identity, the uniformity of nature, right? It's feeling in the political and in the mental realm that keeps us going and that grounds us. And so he uses Locke a lot. He's in conversation with Locke, and then his most famous essay that's often read in political theory classes is Of the Original Contract, in which he's directly in dialogue with Locke's works. So there's a lot there, and I mean, he did want to differentiate himself from Locke, but I don't think he fully extricated himself from sort of the general modern liberal project of Hobbes mostly. Great, one more question perhaps? There's a couple more, go ahead.
At the beginning of your introduction to your book, you mentioned that Hume was looking to introduce his ideas to both men and women of polite society, which is kind of a departure from the circumstances of his time where women weren't really involved in politics because of structural reasons that were preventing them from doing so. What do you think? What do you make of what does Hume think of women as political agents in his views?
Yeah, good question. I think, when he went to France later in his life, 1760s, he was lauded in France. They loved him. And he, the women largely ran the salons, and they were the ones introducing, many of these thinkers, sponsoring them really, and putting them in conversation with each other. And so, Hume saw women as active, capable. Their role was more behind the scenes in this day and age, but I think he would have been, on the side of reform in the 19th century. He was, some people have called him somewhat of a libertine in morals. He was, he had a critique of chastity, and, he probably would have been a defender of the loosening of some moral scriptures, and, but that was after his time, so that's just pure speculation. Thanks for the question. Shall we have one more? Go ahead.
So, kind of piggybacking off that last question, you were talking at the beginning about how Hume was widely read to the extent that, people are just talking about his history, trying to understand the philosophical presumptions behind it. Things aren't really like that today. So, do you think that's because society has changed, or historians doing things differently in a way that's kind of hampering that wider discourse from happening?
Yeah, great. Hume thought that a kind of scholastic approach was too airy, too distant. He thought there was too much separation between scholars and the common person, and he thought we could probably learn more from the honest gentlemen of England than we could from some of these airy metaphysicians who weren't earthy enough. Nature tells us, be a philosopher, but be a man as well. And Hume, learned that lesson in part because he spent a lot of time in his closet theorizing, got kind of depressed and anxious by it, and then went out and had to, have dinner and with friends, have conversations, play some games, and yeah, Hume did his best. He operated on the model of some of the essayists of the early 18th century, who saw Cicero's quote that Socrates brought philosophy down from the heavens and down to earth, into the homes of individuals, and brought about reconsideration of the virtues and vices and good and bad forms of living. And so Hume wanted to breathe life into the people, provide for a kind of sound philosophy to reemerge among the people, and hopefully be an agent for good change. Now, yeah, as far as hopes for today, it's when you develop your YouTube channel and that kind of thing. But I will end with this. An Italian priest commented that Hume somehow managed to cast a magical spell on everyone. He managed to be read, and all of his critics managed to be forgotten. So may you too have that good fortune, may all of us have that good fortune of being read and having our critics forgotten. But this will never be forgotten, this right here. So thank you everybody for coming, and we'll converse some more over food and drink. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Cool.